Hi. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Or Tuesday. Or Monday, I don't know. Tuesday. Uh, I hope you all have a good week. Or Monday, I don't know. Tuesday. But anyways, I got some questions, and most of them are pretty good. A couple of them I've already covered. How many boards did I shape before it clicked? That's kind of a loaded question. After my first board, I thought I had it licked or clicked or whatever. But the consensus back in the day was, and I heard this from other shapers, you need about approximately 1,000 boards under your belt before you start to get, pretty good technically. And there's a difference between a technical shaper and a designer. And then there's the rare few that are designer shapers, true craftsmen. And I have to admit, in the day and age of the computer, it's really benefited a lot of guys. It's really helped speed up their understanding of design. But I don't know. I kind of felt like the first couple hundred boards I did under the Starlight label, I felt they were pretty good. But I definitely still had heroes. One of my heroes, a couple of my heroes, Skip Fry, Bill Castor. Especially Bill Castor. I worked with Skip Fry at GNS for a few years, but Bill Castor was Bill Castor, the master. He unfortunately passed away, 25 years ago. But in the 70s, he made some beautiful boards here in San Diego, and beautiful from start to finish, the shapes and the glassing. And I always kind of held him, at least locally, as a marker. And but in summer of 72, 73 and 74, starting in 72, I got a job shaping for GNS, and I thought it was pretty hot stuff, but I only had a couple hundred boards under my belt. But I learned a tremendous amount at GNS because they were very, very busy at the time, and they would throw orders at us. They're kind of Paul Bordieri, who was like the head shaper, factory manager. He said, "With the good comes the bad, so you better just buckle up and shape whatever we give you." And so, I was kind of limited at that time to kind of down rail, kind of semi-gun type shapes. And then, I learned to shape eggs and all kind, a few long boards. And I got my numbers up at GNS. Paul, there was, I'm blanking on his name now, but there was Skip Fry working there.
Get more centered.
Okay. Skip Fry worked there, and John Hawley and Rob Berdanovich, and I said Paul shaped there, and there was a fellow that did Bing under a Bing license, and his name was I'll get it later. But so I got to learn. I got to try a lot of boards from these different guys. I got to learn. I got to shape a bunch of boards in those 3 years. Even though I was a seasonal shaper, I still probably, shape between 600, 700, 800 boards a summer. And it would tail off in the fall, and I'd go to Hawaii and get a few boards of shape there. And but then I left in the spring of 84 to start 85, spring of 85, to start the Rusty label. And I was at Canyon I left GNS in 74, and then I just did my own thing, music, for a little while. And then I did Canyon surfboards from late 77 through fall of 85. And that's where I really got my numbers up. I was shaping well over 1,000 boards a year, shaping anything and everything. Had some great team riders. And at Canyon, I felt like I finally had a true act. At GNS, I was kind of shaping somebody else's label. I was shaping whatever they gave to me. And grand total, probably by the time I left GNS, I maybe had 2,000 boards under my belt. And at Canyon, the first year or two, I was still kind of limited in my range, but I was shaping well over 1,000 boards a year from late 77 to fall of 85. So with that being said, I think a lot of the new shapers that are being touted and everything, I think they're good, but in a limited space, a limited design space. After a few hundred boards, whatever they're specializing in, they probably make a good board. But to become truly versatile, and you have to have it in your head, truly versatile, I think it takes a few thousand boards. But now with the computers, it takes 5. No, it takes a while to learn the software. Yeah. And then you can learn how to shape. Chris Colpin, Canyon, first bat tails. That's a good question. I mean, it's, I think Corky Carroll or somebody had a bat tail in the late 60s on a longboard or something like that. And but I did some when I was at Canyon in the late 70s, early 80s, and they're different looking. As I said many times, nothing is new, but it really wasn't in the mainstream market. And I had a bat tail model, and Paul Elder drew up the logo, and it had pretty good success. How's it work? It's like a rounded squash tail, but you invert the last couple of inches of tail curvature. So like from about 1.5, 2 inches up back to the point on the tail, the curve was inverted. And so it, in theory, had a little bit more bite and a little bit quicker release. Daniel Perez, Costa Rica needs more rusty boards. Right on. You send the orders and I'll take care of them. How wide should squash tails be? I have for over 40 years I've measured squash tails. I always measured 1 inch up, 6 inches up, 12 inches up, and 18 inches up. And the numbers are fairly consistent. In fact, they're fairly consistent with round tails and everything but a pintail. But basically, I measure the first measurement at 1 inch because the tails vary in curvature. But about 1 inch, you get a good starting point. And squash tails, anywhere from, maybe, I hate to say average, but around 6.5 inches, maybe 6 3/4 inches. 6 1/4, 6 is getting a little bit on the narrow side. And then, there's some wider tail boards these days that I build that are 7 1/4 wide. After that, you start to get a lot of tail area. And then at the 11 inch, at the 6 inch number, you get maybe 11 and change. And then at the 12 inch number, I'd say averages 14.5 to 15 1/4. So there's no set width for a squash tail. It depends on the size of the board, the overall width of the board, the size of the weight of the surfer that's made for. And generally speaking, lighter surfers need less area. The best size board for Costa Rica waves, a 210-pound guy. Believe it or not, that brings up a good question. Like, well, how do I order a custom board? I think for most shapers, at least I like to know the surfer's age, the surfer's height, the surfer's weight, his experience or her experience, how long they have surfed, and how often they get to surf and where they surf. Those are mandatory pieces of information as far as I'm concerned. And I've been wrestling with this because I get a lot of orders that just say a 6'2" SD, no dimensions, no personal info. And I have a questionnaire I send out in case they don't go to the custom board builder and fill it out there. I have a set of questions, about 10 or 12 questions. And sometimes I get answers back, sometimes I get nothing. So when I get nothing, I assume that the surfer has looked on the website and is going off stock dimensions. And I will offer them a stock board with stock dimensions, but I always note that I'm assuming you want stock dimensions, but if you want custom dimensions, feel free to ask. Because if they're not altering the design of the board much other than the size and the basic dimensions, change is pretty easy. It can happen pretty quickly. Now, I get some guys that after about 30 emails and about 15 board changes, I hand them off to Pedro. I have it all goes back to, and this is another question, but I've hand-shaped 50,000 surfboards. I've been doing this for 50 years, and I know I keep repeating myself, but I've designed over 100,000 boards. I have a little bit of an idea what I'm doing. So please, if it's your first custom board, give me a little bit of latitude. So back to the 210-pound guy. I'm sorry. There's the best size board, but what type of board do you want? You want an alternative? You want a performance short board? You want a cruiser? So if you give me a little bit more information, I'd feel a little bit more comfortable about answering that question. Next question is how many boards have you shaped? I just answered that. I don't know, 45, 50,000 hand shapes, and close to it, if not 100, close to it, overall designs. Can you talk about your shaping equipment? Well, every shaper as they go along, most of us have an electric planer. The older shapers have the Skill 100s. And then Clark Foam, before they closed for about 5 years, had a Hitachi. It's the green planer that had a higher RPM, and it tended not to tear as much, but it did have as it kind of bogged on bigger stringers. So yeah, the electric planer is the first tool. Handsaw to cut the board out. As time went by, I began to use a router to cut the board out. Sureform, several sanding blocks, 60, 80, 100, 100, and let me see. Am I back on live? Am I back on live?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and sunscreen. And I used to sunscreen is an interesting one because there's coarser grits and there's finer grits. And I would have brand new pieces of 60 grit, 80 grit, 100 and up to 150 grit screen, but I have used pieces, so I have all kinds of screens, different grits, different amount of use, covering my shaping racks. I don't know. I became that detail oriented that I felt like I needed I don't know, 6, 7, 8 different grits, 4 grits, and 2 phases of wear on each piece of screen. Rocker stick. I think a rocker stick's very important. You can certainly eyeball the rocker. The blanks these days are pretty good. But if you're hand shaping a board, a rocker stick's very important. And believe it or not, there's a lot of thought that goes into the rocker stick because usually. I got to where I liked a 3-sided aluminum 8-foot beam, and 3-sided because it's rigid, and but it's the least amount of weight. The square ones have more weight, and they work. But there's a fine line between having a rocker stick that droops a little bit and one that's very straight, and the key factor there is the weight of that rocker stick, because if the stick is too, if it's a quarter inch walls, it's going to be droopy. 3/16 walls, a little bit droopy, but 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch walls, that's not thickness, that's the height of the 3 sides. You're starting to get into a pretty reliable rod, and as years went by, I found some 3-sided rods that had 1-inch walls, but they're very thin 1-inch walls, and that was a pretty rigid beam, and it didn't really affect, when you put it on the board, it really didn't affect the rocker by making the board flatten out a little bit as you measure it. And, so those, and I think those are all tools that most shapers have or need to have. But then there's all kinds of personalized tools. I've used a belt sander on tail templates forever. You can use an orbital disc for getting into the nose and other places. You can use a bigger disc for flattening the decks and the bottoms. I don't mind using them for the decks, but the bottoms I don't think they're as accurate as a block. And in the blocks, some of the blocks, I used balsa blocks for years and years and years, but I'm probably getting too technical for 99% of you people here, but I started using a slight cushion on the balsa block to absorb, to give a little bit of give to the sandpaper or the sand screen when I was sanding. And there's a company, there's probably several companies now that sell flexible blocks where you can swap out your sandpaper grit. And I think there's a place for a flexible block, primarily the deck. But once again, I don't think they're quite as good on the bottoms. And I've had balsa blocks I shaped with that had slight convex curves to them to do the concaves. But over time, I realized that if I just changed the pattern of my sanding, it would handle the curvature. So.
Guy asking here about Meatling Surfboards. Think about mid-length boards.
Mid-length boards. That is the buzz these days, isn't it? First of all, I think it's important to have one in your quiver. The first board is your everyday board, whatever that is. And maybe your second board, if you like riding a little bit bigger waves, is a step-up board. The step down, the Slayer, is good for certain types of bigger waves, but slabby waves. But like the Slayer 2 and the Blackbird are better all-around step-ups. And then the third board should be some kind of a cruiser. The buzzword right now is mid-length, and I've made mid-length boards all my career. And who's to say what a mid-length board should look like? I mean, we've had the Moby Fish for 20 years. That's a popular mid-length cruiser board. The Yeti, kind of a blown up clean round pin, but not for necessarily for bigger waves, but just for all around surfing. And what's the other? Rick's
Zeppelin.
Zeppelin, yeah. The Zeppelin has a very wide back half and a semi-full nose and kind of relaxed rocker, and that's another good mid-length. But I think a lot of people think of mid-lengths as kind of eggy-looking boards, and once again, I've made eggs since 70, almost 50 years when I was working with Skip. He shaped me some. I tried some stock eggs. I shaped some, and so I think definitely kind of a rounder nose and a fuller round tail, or even a rounded squash tail. Mid-length means 7 to 8 feet, but we're reintroducing a modernized version of the egg. You can. In a few weeks, you'll be able to find some at Huntington Surf and Sport. I'm doing a few customs. We haven't even promoted it yet, but it's pretty cool. It's the template proportions aren't a whole lot different than the older eggs, but it's got more tail rocker and slightly a bit more nose rocker, more modern rails, and they come in 2+1 setups, 4-fin setups, twin fin, whatever fin setup you want, really. But yeah, the concept of a mid-length board is good because it allows you, A, to learn how to draw different lines, and B, it covers a fair range of surf. I mean, they ride small waves pretty well. When the surf starts to get bigger, they can handle it. You have to pull back a little bit, but you can still handle the bigger waves on them. But it's good. It's good to have as you build your quiver, to have if you're an average size surfer, have maybe a 7, 7.6, 8 foot. I think at 8 foot you're starting to talk like mini tanker or something like that. But a lot of shapers. It's huge buzz in Australia right now. Catching on here in the United States. So yeah, I've been building them for almost 50 years, but as I said, we are reintroducing a new mid-length egg. All right. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about cloth. And back in the day, I used to glass my own boards, but I really haven't done any glassing in recent years. But there's a question. I mean, there's one question like, well, what is e-poly? Most people know about EPS, and that refers to the core. EPS, you need to glass with epoxy resin. If you use polyester, you're going to melt the blank, more or less. But the epoxy resin, and the epoxy resin has evolved quite a bit in the last 15 years. There was a fellow up in Santa Barbara that did a lot of epoxy boards. I talked about this last week, I think, in the early mid-'80s. And I think a lot of us shapers tried building them, but the blanks were crude and the resin was, off color. And so we kind of put it to rest. But then in 2005, December 2005, when Clark Foam closed, we ran out of polyurethane foam pretty quick, and we had to source EPS and epoxy. And at that time, there was limited resources but over the years, especially since EPS boards have proven to be a vital piece of the marketplace, there's several companies blowing very nice EPS blanks. Before, they used to cut them out of huge block sheets, and the beads were loosely formed. Now the beads are have a much higher fusion, and the epoxy resin has become very clear, bright, not sacrificing anything in strength. So, yeah, EPS is expanded polystyrene foam and epoxy resin. E-poly is what we call our epoxy glassing polyurethane, which is a traditional foam construction, and it's good that epoxy. I mean, some people might argue no, but epoxy is a little bit greener resin, and but it's stronger. It's quite a bit stronger than polyester resin. You can end up with a slightly lighter board, minimal, but usually they're a little bit lighter, and it maintains its flex. It's important for boards, especially short and maybe even mid-length boards, to flex. It's a big part of how you surf, how you turn and change direction, and so the epoxy has a livelier flex. The polyester resin tends to cure quicker and become more rigid and start to break down. The epoxy resin has a much longer lifespan, stronger, better flex, and a touch greener. And it costs about $50 extra, the epoxy resin, but I think it's well worth it. And I'm sure that at some point in time, I don't know if polyester will be completely outlawed, but the restrictions will become tighter and tighter, and it just makes sense to me at some point. I've been kind of nudging production more towards epoxy, but it's also hard to find experienced epoxy laminators too. And that brings me a little bit to the cloth. Like, most people don't really think about cloth. Traditional cloth we use is E-cloth, and we offer S-cloth. S-cloth has been around for a long time. It's a flatter, tighter weave than the E-cloth, so it holds less resin. It's a little bit more rigid. It has better compression strength, but less shear strength than the E-cloth. The E-cloth will bend a little bit more, and therefore I had a couple boards that I glassed all S-cloth, and they felt good, but one of them buckled, and my boards are so big they rarely buckle, but they held up dent-wise, and so we offer, we'll build an all S-cloth board if you want, but I think the best is the combination is E-bottom, a single layer of E on the top, and a single layer of S, and that will they'll complement each other, the E and the S, and you can also pull a little bit more resin out of a SE combo lay up on the deck. What else? Talk about foils and their purpose. The foil is if you hold a board on its side, or you hold it and you look down, you hold it by the rails. It's you see the rocker, you see the thickness flow, and the thickness flow is the foil refers primarily to the thickness flow of the board. Back in the early days of the short boards, a lot of the designs had thicker foils up front, thinner tails, and as time went by, a few people like Shane Horan experimented with flatter tail rocker, heavier nose rocker, and much thicker tails. This is designed to surf off the tail, and Shane probably lost out on a couple of world titles because he stuck to that design. He came to me once, kind of towards second half of his career, and asked me to build him he just said, build me a 6.2 tri-fin. And this was I think mid 80s, and he ripped on it. He liked it. Never really followed up with him on it, but I mean, my foils these days, I'm a big fan of a neutral foil. If I feel like if a board, if you measure a board, say a foot back from the nose and a foot up from the tail, or 18 inches up, 18 inches back, I like to see those numbers fairly equal. You can fudge maybe a tenth of an inch towards the nose or towards the tail, and this is probably leading to my next question. If you're a front foot surfer or you're a back foot surfer, that has a little bit to do with how you have your foil set up. And then the next question that this leads into, well, it doesn't, kind of leads into it, is asymmetrical boards. And I've talked about them. I've talked about my 1967 Carl Ekstrom asymmetrical, my first board. My next few boards are twin fins, several twin fins, and but I had he's a local guy, La Jolla guy, but he's a very good surfer, very good skater, Henry Hester, and he competed at a fairly high level, but he liked asymmetricals, and I built him very down-railed, kind of semi-flat deck, pretty extreme asymmetrical tails, and he ripped on them. I mean, he surfed in the Hang 10 Grand Prix series one summer, and he made it, I don't know, like quarters or semis in Malibu, I think, and trestles. And I've made myself, some with offset templates and boards for like Josh Kerr. But I told a story about Tom Survey, and he had a magic tri-fin, and he came and he said, I want the same thing. And I said, sure, no problem. I have it in the computer. And so I made him another one. He came back and he says, it's pretty good, but it's not as magic as this first board that I want you to copy. And I looked at it again, and so I took a second shot at it, and he said, well, this one's a little bit better, but it still doesn't have that feel. And so I went over his original board again, and I had all the blank measurements right, but the front fins were offset. One was a half inch farther forward, and one was a half inch farther back. I like to say I planned it that way, but it was an accident. But that, I got my wheels turning. And when I made Josh's asymmetricals, he wanted offset tails, longer rail line for the left, going left. But we also made the rails slightly different thickness and slightly different apexes. And so it would be hard to build asymmetricals for shop boards, because, well, one, they're such an unknown quantity or quality. People might walk in and look at them and go, these look pretty cool, but is it too extreme or is it not enough? But I think if you work on a custom basis with a shaper, you might bring up next time, what about we offset my fins a little bit? Or what about we soften one rail more than the other? And I mean, that's an asymmetrical board, but it's subtle and it'll work. So,
Torsion Spring, can you tell me more about it?
Torsion Spring. yeah, I've talked about Torsion Spring before, and no, we did not catch the Del Mar thief yet. Bad karma, dude. Bad karma. But the Torsion Spring is, it's a third type of foam. It's an extruded polystyrene, and they both start extruded and expanded. Both start as beads, but the beads are and expanded. They're small beads, and they get put into a chamber, and they get heated up, and they expand, and they seal. And depending on the pressure and the size of the chamber that they're being blown into, they have different types of fusion. The extruded is the beads get melted, and then they get extruded, and it basically ends up being almost like vertical columns. And so it's a little bit denser than, well, you can get EPS 3 pounds, 2 pounds, 1.5 pounds, 1 pound. But the extruded polystyrene comes in vertical columns. It's a little bit, it's in between your average polyurethane blank and your average EPS blank. As I said, there's different weights for everything, but the average. And it's the beauty of the extruded polystyrene is it's been used in the manufacturing industry, I don't know, 50 plus years, because it's waterproof. And the companies that blow it, like Dow, have always color-coded it blue. And I had a fellow come up from Peru 20 years ago and present me with this foam, and it was blue. But he said, "Oh, it's unreal. You got to try it." I tried it. I built some boards. Guys really liked the way they rode and they held up. He wanted help importing it, and I wasn't ready to at that time, so he sold it to a company now. It's called XTR. But the one thing about Torsion Spring that at first we kind of knew that we had to air it out, because it's as the blank gives a little bit, the foam gives off gas, and it needs to escape somehow, or it will cause a delamination. So with time, we actually got help from what's his name at XTR, Javier, on how to make mini pinholes in the deck only, and that allows the gas to escape, but it doesn't let the water really, it doesn't really absorb water. And so the beauty of a torsion spring board is it's more durable than the E-poly. It's got a livelier flex, and it's got a more durable flex. And the only downside is cosmetic, and that's the holes. And we've realized that customers have been receiving their boards, and we need to put a disclaimer. I think we have a mention, but we need to put a big, broad statement about the cosmetics of a torsion spring. All the XTR boards have the holes. I'm sure other builders that make extruded styrofoam boards have run into this issue as well. So you're actually better off with the pinholes than you are with if it's an extruded styrofoam blank. Anything else to add to?
Well, the torsion, we have no stringer. We got the Kevlar and carbon tapes.
Yeah, it's a technical build too. It's not just slapping epoxy on a blank with a stringer. It's and we've made stringerless boards before, but the torsion spring blank typically does not have a stringer, and so to compensate for that, we have carbon and Kevlar tape. Yeah, and applying the Kevlar tape on the rails is especially difficult, and there's not many guys that want to take it on, and so that's the primary reason why it just takes a lot more time to build them. And but most people who have gotten them and ridden them have said it's well worth it. When they reorder, they use a reorder torsion spring
And we're pretty much the only ones that playing with Kevlar.
Yeah. XTR doesn't.
No Kevlar.
Yeah. So the Kevlar cloth, for those of you who don't know, the carbon is
rigid.
It's rigid, and you can build an all carbon board, but you can break them in half. You know, they look I don't know, stealth or whatever, all carbon boards, but they will break.
Yeah.
Kevlar is the stuff they use in bulletproof vests, or they used to. It doesn't break.
So it absorbs the impact.
It absorbs the impact, and it makes for a much stronger board. And then there's problems when you're laminating, getting the different, the carbon and the regular cloth, especially around the laps, and then the Kevlar to all fuse together in a nice, clean, in a clean way, so that you don't have sand through issues too. So, I think. I don't know. I'd like to think in the future all boards will be some form of extruded waterproof styrofoam and epoxy.
Well, this guy here is asking you, how far back do you usually place quad fins on a mid-length? And how far apart from each other?
Fin placement? It depends on the length of the board. A typical 6-foot board would be like 10 7/8 on the front fins, and 3 3/8 on the rear fins. That's on average, give or take an eighth of an inch or so. As the boards get longer, like a 7-foot gun, I might have the fins at 12 and 4. That's for a tri-fin. For a quad, what I do is I take the distance, say a 7-foot board, mid-length board or whatever, 12 inches. I cut that in half and I get 6 inches, which is where I'd put a tri-fin tail fin. But then, no, it's 4 inches. But half the distance is 6 inches. So I split that in half, and that's where I put the 4 fins at 5 inches on a quad, so 12 and 5. And it's pretty much true from, as you go up the ladder. I got a brewer gun that he shaped me as the 9.4. He shaped me a few years ago, just for my collection, and the fins are up 15 inches, the front fins.
That brewer.
They're up pretty far. Wow. But it's not how far apart the fins are, really. The primary measurement that I use is from the distance from the rail to the back of the fin. And once again, that depends on the width of the tail. But front fins, I usually go 1.25 inches to 1.1 inches. I think as the fins get any closer to the rail, it kind of hinders the board going rail to rail a little bit. And then the rear fins, I have 1 3/8 to 1.5 inches from the rail. And the reasoning behind that is, I think if the fins are like 12 and 6, like a tri-fin, the board starts to lose drive. If the tri-fin, once again, 12 and 4. If you have your front fins at 12 and your rear fins at 4, the board will be too drivey, too linear in its turns. And if you move it up to the halfway point, 12 and 6, it'll start to lose drive. So I found that the half of the half is a good balance. Yeah.
That's a good one. Do you think there will come a day where no traditional PE boards will be on tour?
Yes. I don't know if y'all heard that, but will there come a day when there will no longer be PUPE, polyurethane polyester boards on tour? And the answer is definitely yes. The wheel keeps turning. You know, in the early 50s, you probably could have asked somebody, do you think boards will ever be made out of anything but wood? But there'll come a time when I think epoxy will become more prevalent, and eventually people will realize that the value they get from a better foam is worth the extra 50, 100, 120 bucks. I tell people that I know that everybody isn't in coffee and not everybody goes to Starbucks, but if you skip your Starbucks habit every day, you can get a couple boards a year. You know, you get a new board, you ride for a while, and you sell it used. You might get 300, 350 bucks for it, and the next board costs you $1 a day. You know, it's like when I first started surfing, I remember gas was 20 cents a gallon, and surfboards, brand new surfboards in the shops were roughly 200 bucks. So you take that ratio to today, it's not 20 cents a gallon, it's not $2 a gallon, it's a factor of 20, $4 a gallon, at least here in Southern California. $4 a gallon, so that's a factor of 20. And boards, $200 versus 8 to 1,000, it's a factor of 4 or 5. So surfboards are still a pretty good deal, I think. But the nature of the business is anybody can do it, and especially now with all the computer cutting services and the glassing services, the average person can probably get a okay board. But as you want your surfing to progress, I'd suggest going with an experienced shaper.
Flashback. Tell me more about the Aviso carbon fiber run of boards you did. Remember those?
Yes.
All black boards?
Yes.
Hollow?
Yeah.
Boom, boom, boom.
Yeah, I don't know, was it 15, 20 years ago? Maybe 20 years ago.
About that.
Yeah, I was a company up in Newport that builds racing yachts. They won the...
They were very strong.
Very, very strong. They're experts in carbon manufacturing. Yeah. And the father, the owner of the business, surfed, but his son at the time was like in his maybe early 30s. And so they got together and they got in touch with myself and a few other popular builders at the time and said, would you design us some boards? And we'll give you some at no cost to try and let us know what you think. And we think we can make a business out of it. And so the Aviso boards were hollow carbon. And they had if I remember right, they had a little nose plug in it. Some people surfed them without the nose plug in, but the idea is when you get out of the water, you take the plug out so the board can expand and contract with the heat. And the freaky thing about them is they sound like a drum. If you tapped on them, depending on the size of the board, they had a different pitch, but they sound like a drum. And they definitely, you think EPS is a little bit twitchy. These boards are pretty frisky, and we made them commercially for a couple of years, but surfers are cheapskates, you guys. Sorry to say, but
including ourselves.
But they ran about $400 more than a regular surfboard, and I think part of the problem was the actual cost, but I think it was a good step forward. Testing new materials, and what was the ski company? Solomon tried to get in the surfboard business too at one point, and their boards are all blue because they're using sheet foam
from Dow.
From Dow, extruded sheet foam, but they are hollow, and they had a hard time figuring out just how much ribbing was enough and what wasn't enough, and they hired a few key players to promote them, and but I think Solomon realized how difficult it was to make a good surfboard, and B, they realized there's no money in the surfboard market. But
I got one last question. I think here we've got 7 minutes. Since EPS floats more, how many liters less from PU board?
Excuse me.
That's a general question.
Yeah, EPS. I think 2-pound EPS weighs 8 to 10% less than a stock weight polyurethane. So you can have two boards of the same volume, but they're going to float differently. You imagine, and once again, I always take design questions, take them to the extreme. If you had an EPS board that weighed 2 pounds and you had a board the same volume out of balsa and it weighed 25 pounds, which one's going to float better? Which one's going to paddle better? And it's also a percentage as you go up. And I spent some time explaining this to a fellow yesterday that the difference between a 26 and a 27 liter board is about a third of a liter. No, sorry, the percentage is 0.37 between 26 liters and 27 liters. So the percentage difference is 0.37, and the difference between he wanted a 48 liter board, and I gave him a 49.5 liter board, and that, even though the difference was 1.5 liters, the percentage difference was 0.35. So as the boards get longer and they get more volume, the percentage difference, the percentage difference can stay similar, but as you get into bigger boards, I think you get a wider spread on the volume.
We're about
almost there.
How wide should tails be?
I addressed that earlier, and it's really it goes back to how wide. First question was how wide should squash tails be, but this is more of a general question. It's really, let's just say hot dog boards. I build 14 1/4, 14 1/2, all the way up to 15 3/4, 16 inches, and then fishes are obviously wider.
We're like 7:56. Got like 3-4 minutes if you want to.
Okay, I got time for one or two more questions. What have you?
John's asking round squash.
Volume.
Oh.
I know I talk about this every week. And I'm going to add a disclaimer. If you go on my website and you go to the custom board build section, there's a thing about the beauty of a custom board. You can pick a stock board if you want, but if you have a little bit of experience and you've got some boards under your belt, you might want to let me customize the board for you. But the thing on volume is a lot of the boards on the website, the stock boards are pretty much right on. Some there's a variance, and the variance comes from time, the model's evolving, and also the real volume, not the overall volume, the real volume being bigger or lower. But I'm adding a disclaimer that basically says you have to choose which way you want me to lean. thickness or volume. You can't have them both exactly all the time. There's going to be some variance. So you have to tell me which way you want to go. Strictly volume, strictly thickness, or leave it up to me somewhere in between. But since everybody has become volume experts, I have to share that little bit of truth with you. I have several licensees that when they order boards, they order them a length, a width, and a thickness and a volume, but they say the target is the volume. So, if you're interested in ordering a custom board, keep that in mind. That's it for today. All of you have a good week. I hope you get some surf and stay healthy.